Welcome to Capital Catch-Up, the podcast where we break down the latest developments in Congress. I'm Victor.
And I'm Leanie. Today we're diving deep into a slate of new legislation, a wave of key nominations, and highlights from the recent congressional record. Let's get started.
First up, the House has introduced a series of bills that touch on everything from wildlife conservation to labor standards. The first is House Bill 8850, which would create dedicated funds to conserve butterflies in North America, plants in the Pacific Islands, freshwater mussels across the United States, and desert fish in the Southwest. Conservationists see this as a targeted approach to protect species that are often overlooked in broader environmental bills.
It's a reminder that the Endangered Species Act, passed back in 1973, set the precedent for federal involvement in protecting wildlife. By earmarking funds for specific groups, this bill could streamline grant applications and ensure that money reaches the habitats that need it most. For everyday Americans, healthier ecosystems can mean better water quality and more robust pollination for crops.
Next, we have House Bill 8868, an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. It proposes a minimum salary threshold for bona fide executive, administrative, and professional employees, often called white-collar workers, who are currently exempt from overtime. The bill also includes an automatic annual update to that threshold.
The Fair Labor Standards Act was a cornerstone of the New Deal, establishing the 8-hour workday and overtime pay. Over time, the exemption for salaried professionals has created a loophole, where many workers put in long hours without extra pay. If this bill passes, more employees could qualify for overtime, potentially boosting household incomes for a sizable segment of the workforce.
Moving to housing, House Bill 8854 sets up a pilot program for the Department of Housing and Urban Development to evaluate ensuring mortgages that finance basement conversions into safe, habitable dwelling units. This could open up new affordable housing options in dense urban areas where space is at a premium.
Historically, HUD's mortgage insurance programs have focused on single-family homes. By testing basement conversions, the agency is exploring a creative way to increase housing supply without new construction, which can be costly and time-consuming. If successful, families could gain extra living space at a lower cost, easing pressure on the rental market.
On the health front, House Bill 8869 amends the Public Health Service Act to authorize research on the impacts of traumatic birth experiences and post-traumatic stress disorder on mothers, infants, and families. This is a crucial step toward understanding and treating perinatal mental health issues.
The Public Health Service Act, originally passed in 1944, has been the legal foundation for many NIH initiatives. By specifically targeting traumatic birth and PTSD, this bill could unlock new funding streams for longitudinal studies, ultimately improving outcomes for mothers and children.
Security and law enforcement get a mention with House Bill 8842, which amends Title 49 of the United States Code to provide eligibility for federal law enforcement officers to receive certain expedited security screenings. It's a modest but practical improvement for officers who travel frequently.
And speaking of law enforcement, House Bill 8862 proposes to waive immunity for certain acts committed by federal law enforcement officers. That could have significant implications for accountability and civil rights litigation, echoing debates that have been ongoing since the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The infrastructure arena sees the Local Infrastructure Financing Tools Act, known as the LIFT Act. House Bill 8864. It offers a tax credit for interest payments on American infrastructure bonds issued between 2026 and 2033, with the credit percentage decreasing over time. It also tweaks rules for advance refunding bonds and tax-exempt interest expense allocation for financial institutions.
This builds on the historic push for infrastructure investment that dates back to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. By making bonds more attractive to investors, the LIFT Act could lower borrowing costs for cities and towns, accelerating projects like road repairs, water systems, and broadband expansion, directly benefiting everyday commuters and businesses.
The National Guard also gets a nod with House Bill 8848, which adds the National Guard Relief Foundation to the definition of military welfare society in certain statutes. This could streamline benefits and support for Guard families.
That's an important acknowledgement of the Guard's dual role as both state and federal responders, a concept that dates back to the Militia Act of 1903. Expanding the definition helps ensure that families receive the same welfare benefits as active duty service members.
Turning to the Social Security Act, House Bill 8857 adjusts, which engineered cyclic peptides qualify as single-source drugs for the Drug Price Negotiation Program. This is a technical but impactful change for the pharmaceutical pricing landscape.
The Drug Price Negotiation Program, established under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, aims to bring down prescription costs. By clarifying which specialty drugs qualify, the bill could speed up negotiations and lower out-of-pocket expenses for seniors and other beneficiaries.
In the realm of occupational health, House Bill 8863 amends Title V to add certain Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives employees, specifically certified fire investigators and members of the National Response Team, to the definition of employees in fire protection activities for compensation purposes. This expands eligibility for benefits related to illnesses caused by fire-related work.
It's a reminder of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which set the stage for workplace injury compensation. Extending coverage to these specialized agents acknowledges the unique risks they face.
Immigration policy is addressed with House Bill 8847, which amends the Immigration and Nationality Act to make aliens convicted of violations of state or federal hunting or fishing laws inadmissible and deportable. It's a niche, but symbolic measure linking wildlife protection to immigration enforcement.
While the practical impact may be limited, it signals a broader trend of using immigration law to enforce a variety of policy goals, a practice that has roots in the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986.
Health education also appears in House Bill 8867, directing the Secretary of Health and Human Services to develop a public education initiative on long-term care planning as part of the National Clearinghouse for Long-Term Care Information. With an aging population, this could help families prepare financially for future care needs.
The Medicare and Medicaid programs have long grappled with long-term care costs. By increasing public awareness, the bill could reduce the future strain on these programs and on families who might otherwise face unexpected expenses.
Early childhood education is front and center with the Creating Early Childhood Leaders Act, House Bill 8859. It amends the Higher Education Act of 1965 to require training for principals and school leaders on child development, social-emotional learning, and instructional leadership for children from birth through age 8.
Investing in early childhood has been shown to yield high returns. Think of the Perry Preschool study from the 1960s. By strengthening school leadership, this bill aims to improve the quality of pre-K programs, which can set children on a path to academic success.
The National Institutes of Health gets a directive through House Bill 8852 to design a program studying the health effects of nuclear radiation on women. Historically, radiation research has focused on male subjects, so this fills a critical gap.
The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 authorized civilian nuclear research, but gender-specific data has been scarce. Understanding how radiation impacts women could inform safety standards for medical imaging, occupational exposure, and even space travel.
Finally, House Bill 8860 seeks to enhance the prosecution of corporate crime by amending Title 18. It's part of a broader push to hold large companies accountable for wrongdoing, echoing the corporate crime reforms of the 1970s.
Strengthening corporate prosecution can deter fraud, environmental violations, and other harms that affect consumers and the environment. It's a step toward restoring public trust in the marketplace.
That covers the legislative slate. Let's shift to the nominations that the Senate is reviewing. The list includes several United States attorneys: Kevin Holmes for the Western District of Arkansas, Andrew Benson for the District of Maine, William Boyle for the Eastern District of North Carolina, Darren Smith for the District of Wyoming, Zachary Keller for the Western District of Louisiana, Richard Price for the Western District of Missouri, Brian David Miller for the Middle District of Pennsylvania, and James Bishop for the Middle District of North Carolina.
United States attorneys serve as the chief federal law enforcement officers in their districts, overseeing prosecutions and civil litigation. Their confirmation requires a simple majority vote in the Senate after committee review, a process that can take weeks or months depending on the political climate.
Beyond the U.S. attorneys, we have high-profile appointments. Matthew Anderson, nominated as Deputy Administrator of NASA, Wesley Brooks as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Mark Ditlevson, and Brian Birdwell as Assistant Secretaries of Defense. Daniel Edwards as Assistant Secretary of Transportation, and Ademola Adewale Sadiq as United States Director of the African Development Bank.
These roles are critical. For example, the Deputy Administrator of NASA helps shape the agency's direction on missions to the Moon and Mars, while the Assistant Secretary for Oceans oversees policies on marine conservation and climate resilience. Each nominee will undergo a Senate confirmation hearing, where they'll be questioned on their qualifications, policy positions, and any potential conflicts of interest.
The Senate also received a nomination for Brian Barber as United States Marshal for the Western District of Louisiana. Marshals are responsible for federal court security, fugitive apprehension, and witness protection, a role that dates back to the Judiciary Act of 1789.
All these nominations reflect the administration's priorities in law enforcement, scientific advancement, and international development. Watching the confirmation votes will give us insight into how smoothly the Senate moves on these appointments.
Now let's turn to the congressional record entries. On May 14th, the House heard Representative Rashida Tlaib introduce the Make DTE Pay Act. The bill would increase monetary penalties for utilities that violate the Clean Air Act, aiming to hold companies accountable when they prioritize shareholder profits over public health.
The Clean Air Act, originally passed in 1963 and significantly amended in 1970, set national air quality standards. By raising penalties, the Make DTE Pay Act could incentivize utilities to invest in cleaner technologies, potentially reducing pollutants that affect asthma rates and other health outcomes.
Representative Tlaib also spoke out against Republican-led redistricting efforts she says are designed to dilute black voting power. She called for stronger enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, which, although weakened by the 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder, remains a cornerstone of voting equity.
Redistricting happens every 10 years after the census, and the process can be manipulated through gerrymandering. Tlaib's push reflects a long-standing battle over fair representation that dates back to the Reconstruction era.
Homelessness was another focus. Tlaib highlighted that roughly 771,000 people are unhoused on any given night in the United States and advocated for the Unhoused Persons Bill of Rights resolution, which seeks to boost affordable housing and expand services for those experiencing homelessness.
The federal government has addressed homelessness through programs like HUD's Continuum of Care, but critics argue that funding has not kept pace with need. A Bill of Rights could create a more coordinated national response, potentially reducing the number of people sleeping on the streets.
The session also honored community leader Cale Turn for her work with immigrant and refugee families, celebrated Harris Baking Company's 100th anniversary, and observed National Police Week. These recognitions remind us that Congress often uses the floor to highlight local heroes and milestones.
Moving back a day, the May 13th record featured a series of recognitions. Representatives honored Texas police officers Juan Zuniga and Roman Gonzalez, as well as Edinburgh Police Chief Jaime Ayala, for their dedication to public safety. Other honorees included Sergeant Joshua Roque, longtime resident Burton Corwin, and the sorority Alpha Delta Pi on its 175th anniversary.
The House also celebrated Mexican folk musicians Juan Diaz and Victor Pichardo, who received the National Heritage Fellowship, and recognized Coach Mike Pickett's retirement after 28 years at St. John's Country Day School. Additionally, a member highlighted Skin Cancer Awareness Month, reminding listeners that skin cancer is the most common cancer in the United States, but is largely preventable.
These recognitions serve a dual purpose. They acknowledge individual contributions and help humanize the legislative body for constituents. They also provide a glimpse into the cultural and community values that shape policy priorities.
To sum up, we've covered a broad array of legislation, from wildlife conservation and labor reforms to infrastructure financing and health research, plus a slate of important nominations and the human stories highlighted in the recent congressional record. All of these pieces will shape policy and everyday life in the months ahead.
Listeners should keep an eye on the progress of the Fair Labor Standards Amendment, the LIFT Act, and the Make DTE Pay Act, as they have direct implications for workers, taxpayers, and public health. Also watch the Senate confirmation calendar for the U.S. Attorney appointments and the high-profile agency nominees, since their confirmations will affect law enforcement, space exploration, and environmental policy.
That's it for today's episode of Capital Catch-Up. Thanks for joining us.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.